Hello, everybody. There we go.
Brilliant. Yeah, we're going to be here for a while, and we've got a lot to discuss. I'm really excited about this because I was saying, when I was at university, if you'd asked me what I wanted to do, and you'd taken off all the reins, you know, it doesn't have to be in the careers library, just make up a job, I would have said futurologist. But then I've met you now, and I've realised that being a futurologist is not quite what I thought it was. Because, I mean, you can try and do it and predict the future, but this is exactly what your book's about. You're probably going to get it wrong, aren't you?
Yeah, absolutely. Nice to see everybody. This is a good event. I'm very excited to be here. I'm over my jet lag now, so I'm good. Yeah, I mean, I don't refer to myself as a futurist or a futurologist. I'm a designer. I grew up as a designer. I just happen to have spent my career thinking about the future for lots of big companies and lots of interesting groups of people. So I've naturally sort of fallen into it. It wasn't necessarily something that I was setting out to do from school, but yeah, I found myself here.
And when you first started, I mean, let's go back to when you first started working with, you know, future prediction type work. What did they get you in for? What was the first thing you were asked to do?
I mean, it sort of grew gradually. So I studied industrial design at university in the 90s. Remember them? And I was one of the early engineers for James Dyson's company, Dyson. So working on designing vacuum cleaners. But obviously, when you're working in a company like that, there's always something in the back room getting developed. And I got dragged into that work. And so I started to focus more on longer term horizons and started to think about things further on. And from there, I went to the Royal College of Art and studied design there and got to meet people like Tony Dunn and Fiona Raby. I don't know if they're household names, but big pivotal figures in the kind of futures exploration space. And from there, kind of developed a more rigorous, kind of skeptical view of the future and the emergence of technologies, and was brought into companies like Sony. So Sony was the first place I worked in the UK in that kind of explicitly future-oriented role, trying to figure out what emerging technologies might mean and what we might do with them, and trying to understand future behaviors and the way that people were living their lives and the directions that things were heading, and trying to obviously develop products that might make sense for them. So Sony, and then I used to work for Nokia, which is, anyone remember Nokia? Obviously, I did my job great.
I was going to say, probably don't put that one on the CV.
Yeah, but it was really good fun. We did quite a lot of work in emerging markets there. We spent a lot of time in India and places like that, looking at how people were starting to use things like virtual currencies and stuff like that we take for granted now. And that's what took me over to the States, where I helped set up an advanced design team in Silicon Valley, and I've been there since 2012. And then, yeah, was at Google for a while, and then I led the design team at Google X for about 8 years, and I left there in 2023, and that's my whole LinkedIn.
What I think is really interesting about that is that when we talk about the future, we talk about futures generally, the conversations that we instinctively want to have are not necessarily the conversations that you're being paid or being asked to have. Fundamentally, the people who are employing you are wanting to know where they're going to make money in the future. What can I sell people? But that's not necessarily what people want to know, is it?
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously very complicated territory, and we'll cover about 3% of it in this conversation. But I think as a designer, as a person, I spent my life trying to understand people. Like, people think design is a sort of eloquent, expressive act, not the kind of design I do. I like to try and understand people and habits and behaviors, and I like to understand that bit where people and products and culture and society sort of overlap and try and make sense of it. Obviously, I have a technological bent, and that's the sort of tools that I use to explore that space. And I found in my conversations, so I've worked in obviously some interesting companies. I think they're interesting. And during those years, I've met people from design backgrounds, technologists, physicists, scientists, investors, CEOs, finance people, all sorts of different sorts of people. And they all like to talk about what a technology is, or what they might be able to make with it, or what it might enable, but they never really talk about what it might mean. And I think that's where people who come from the arts, and in my background in design, I think we can bring something else to the conversation there and start to give it a bit more shape and start to think a bit more about the implications of the things that we're creating and the knock-on secondary and tertiary states of the world that we might be creating. So the teams that I've been a part of and the teams that I've led have sort of naturally fed into that part of the huge jigsaw puzzles that we're building.
When you talked about what things might mean, that leads me into something else which you talk about really, really well, which is that when we try and attach meaning to the future, we often end up in extremes, don't we? Tell me about some of those extremes.
Yeah. So the book that I've written, this is the part that my publicist would have me say, it's called Could, Should, Might, Don't. So I feel like after having talked to people for a long time about the future, I feel like it's a skill that we haven't really developed very well. Nobody's very good at it. And when I say not very good, what I mean is we sort of jump straight into solutions or ideas without thinking about where they come from or the shape of our thinking. And I think we all fall into one of those 4 pots of thinking, either could, should, might, or don't. And we can perhaps talk about that in some more detail. But I think what that leads to is very imbalanced, sort of not fit for purpose conversations about the future that feel sort of underpowered. And I think that's sort of gotten us to the place where we are today. I think we're all living in time capsules that were accidentally planted by previous generations who also were not very good at thinking about the future or didn't dedicate enough time and rigor to doing that work. So the purpose of the book that I've written is to try and say, I think these patterns exist, and just trying to outline the origins and the strengths and the weaknesses of each, so that when we start to talk about the future, we can hopefully spread ourselves across all 4 of those domains and get some, I would say, better futures work out there.
Well, let's break it down then, shall we? I'm in an academic frame of mind, so could, should, might and don't. Let's start with could. We're talking there about people saying we could be flying flying to work in flying cars. We could be X. What's the problem with could?
Yeah, so I feel like I've got my back to you lot. I'm really sorry. I feel I might turn halfway through and talk to you, but then I wouldn't be... Anyway, you get it.
Do what you want.
It's the shape of the room. So could futurism. So this is a way of thinking about the future as a sort of unwritten space of possibility. And we can fill it with all of the things that we could do. And I think because we're still in the last throes of modernism, I think we've obliged largely through technocratic means. Like the idea of putting new future versions of ourselves and the world in front of us has typically been elevated and brought to thinking by technology. And we've obliged by thinking about the future as these sort of crystal amazing cities and robots and flying cars and all this sort of escapist stuff that's been absolutely accelerated by the growth and prevalence of science fiction cinema. And a lot of the people I've worked with and a lot of the sort of common discourse around the future is built off that backbone of possibility and amazing difference and amazing newness. And the challenge that I have with could futurism is manyfold, but it treats the future as somewhere else, somewhere other, rather than an evolution of today, which is what it is. We have to get through the weekend to get to the future. It has to grow from where we are. It also, because it pulls very heavily from things like science fiction, it treats the future as a place filled with heroes and heroic behaviors and heroic people. So a could futurist version of something like VR involves heart surgeons and people designing rockets and building cities. When you look at the stats, it's about 70% playing games and the rest is watching YouTube. That's the reality. It's people like us will exist in the future. So could futurism is useful. And not just technocratic could futurism. I talk about that a lot because it's so dominant and it's a very prevalent way that a lot of people and also a lot of Silicon Valley leaders talk about the future. It gets people excited, it gets them motivated, it gets them energized about the sort of possibility of the future. But it's often very non-rigorous, it's escapist, it's heroic, and it doesn't sort of deal with the fact that we have to evolve from where we are. It doesn't talk about any kind of interstitial stages. So that's what I call could futurism.
I really like that. You just reminded me of me when I bought my first MacBook, like the week before. The person who I thought I was going to be after I bought it, and then 2 weeks later, just downloading music and movies and going, this thing hasn't transformed my life at all.
Yeah, and again, it's advertising plays in that space a lot as well. And it's sort of what I call trickle-down futures, which comes a lot from advertising world, where you buy these sneakers, you run as fast as Usain Bolt. It's sort of this escapist, never quite getting there kind of future. It's always just over there somewhere. And again, it can be useful and people use it and there's benefits to it, but it is, if you just do that and you pull yourself to that corner of the map, I think you're missing a big part of the conversation.
Well, you end up buying an iPad.
Yeah.
Let's talk about should futurism, because I think that's one of the ones that we probably are quite aware of it. I think of should futurism, I think of Jesus. I think of people who are telling us what it should be, who are trying to tell us what we're doing wrong and how we have to change and what should be different. But again, why is that dangerous?
I think there are a couple of types of should futurism. So should futurism, just to get a definition out of the way, is a way of thinking about the future as a destination, a kind of a dot in the future, a place to head towards.
Heaven.
or like a place that we think is coming. So obviously organized religions and all sort of theocratic history has that. It has a story of an end point or a goal or a terminus, but also all of our sort of models of society, our manifesto-driven ways of thinking about the future are all aiming to steer us towards where we should go. And that's basically an expression of an ideology. Like, we all have ideologies and moral structures and ethical codes within all of us. We all know what we should do given any problem or question posed to us. In more sort of business-related should futurism, I think we don't trust things like, we've used a lot of ways to sort of predict the future in the past, from cutting open the bellies of goats and looking at the entrails or looking at the stars and saying we should do that. I think what we've largely traded that for in business is data, and started to say, when we ascribe something a number, we can measure it over many days or months or years, and patterns start to appear. And when patterns start to appear, if it was 20 last week and it's 40 this week, your brain just says it's 60 next week. And that dotted line just suddenly appears, and we should head there. But the truth of that and that reliance on data to tell us where we should go, it conceals the thing that we all know to be true. Anyone that's got any money in the stock market or made an investment, once that solid line turns to a dotted line, it ceases to be data and it becomes a story. But the people who work in that world, and they say they have such certainty because there's such empirical rigor to numbers, they feel so definitive. But again, anything beyond right now is a story. A ship could get stuck in the Suez Canal. Kendall Jenner could say something bad about your brand. Anything could happen that throws off all your projections and your predictions. When it comes back to sort of the Jesus reference or the theocratic version of should or the sort of moral version of should, I think that the challenge that we've got with that is we don't check in the room before we start suggesting things. It's in my experience, I'm sort of come from a business perspective. I used to work for a company that said they wanted to make the world a radically better place, but no one ever really said what they meant by better. And so many of these sort of corporate vision statements have the word better in them. IKEA's does, Nike's does, Apple's does, but they never explain what they mean by better. So I don't think we go around the room and check that we're all heading towards the should before we start proposing ideas and solutions. And so we're all sort of heading on different tacks.
Listening to you there, that all makes perfect sense. And then I wonder about the maybe. What's wrong with a maybe? Surely that's the best kind of futurism, maybe.
I love the way we're working through these. It's good. So yeah, might futurism is sort of the opposite of should. This idea of looking at the future as a terrain of uncertainty and filling it with lots and lots of different scenarios. So the idea of playing chess, for example. If I do this, they might do that, and then I might do this, and so they might do that. And this idea of sort of running through if this, then that, models of the future. And we all do this if we're planning a party. We have an idea of what we might do if it rains, or if somebody turns up with a nut allergy, we need to have some contingency for them. So this way of thinking is natural, but it became more formalized with things like game theory, and in the Cold War, the idea of scenario planning, and companies like Rand, who sort of used large-scale computers to try and plot out hundreds and often thousands of scenarios if we actually got into a conflict with the USSR. I say we there, new American citizens, sorry. But yeah, that way of thinking about the future as a terrain of might. Now, it probably represents a best-in-class way of thinking about the future, this idea of uncertainty. I think I encourage in everyone that we don't know the path of the future, so it's imperative that we keep lots of different options open. And if you hire a sort of professional futurist or a professional foresight practitioner, this is the kind of work you'll get. But the challenge is our imagination about the future is notoriously bad, even at a sort of cerebral level. I'm epileptic, so I've had a lot of brain scans, and I've got to know quite a lot of brain people as a result. And what they're discovering is if you ask somebody to imagine the future, the very same parts of the brain light up as if you ask them to remember the past. So they believe that memory is actually a function that we keep to try and project forwards, which sort of makes sense. I burnt my hand on that pan, so I'm not going to do that again. The challenge, therefore, is that's why magic works. When Paul Daniels pulls a cat out of a bag or something, it feels like magic because we've never experienced that scenario before. It feels like we wouldn't able to imagine it. And I think that's the challenge. So companies like Nokia, like Kodak, like Blockbuster, they either didn't see that particular scenario ahead of them, or if they did, they put it way out into the impossible or way off into the distance. So our ability to imagine sufficiently broadly about the future is the challenge of might futurism, that we can never know everything, and we're notoriously bad at sort of imagining things.
And then, obviously, there's the big extreme. You know where we're going. Don't.
Yes.
I think I can answer this myself, but what is the danger of don't futurism?
Yeah, so don't futurism, just to wrap this up into a nice, neat bow. Don't futurism as a way of thinking about the future, or thinking about the parts of the future we want to steer away from, the things that we don't like, the places we wouldn't want to be. And again, religions do a good job of this. That's why things like hell and purgatory exist. And also why a lot of our laws exist, to sort of steer us away from societies or individual acts that we find that we don't want to be. And it's a useful thing. And it's become ever more prevalent in sort of popular conversation about the future because of current events and the state that we find ourselves in. I think the challenge with it is that over time, if you find yourself, again, just dragged into that one corner of don'tism or don't futurism, it can feel like just sort of this huge weight of compression, and you sort of lose hope. And we were talking a bit earlier, there's this pervasive feeling that a lot of young people have now, which they term ambient adolescent apocalypticism, which is starting to really...
saying that. He said that 3 times since I've met him.
It took me a long time to learn how to say it. But it is that feeling of sort of hopelessness about the future, which can just be crushing. And I'm not saying we have to disregard it and just get positive again, because I think there's been a bit of a swing. There's been a few books like Abundance and this sort of upwinging that I hear a lot of in my part of the world, where it's just let's be blindly optimistic, which I don't think is helpful either. But I guess what I'm talking, and that sort of rounds it all out, is each of those ways of thinking about the future, I do think they have clear benefits and can be very useful. But what I think happens is we all find ourselves just nestling in one of those corners, whether we're doing it at work or just chatting about the future down the pub or having a chat on stage in front of people. And what I'm calling for, if I'm calling for anything, I'm not that kind of guy really, but what I would like to see is more rigor and more depth and willingness to go into those 4 spaces when we're talking about the future, either say in business or just chatting with friends, so that we're making sure we're sort of covering all that base and bringing a level of depth of discourse about the future into, everyday life.
I can tell you're not a person who normally calls for things, because you're being very measured and reasonable about it all, and that's not really what people who call for things tend to do.
I grew up in Derby. It's not a place for manifestos, really. So
you made me think then of, when you're talking about don't future, you made me think of health and safety laws. It's a classic example, isn't it, where it's a constant, he's going to do this, let's make a law to stop that, and let's stop that, and let's stop that, and then we end up in this health and safety gone mad sort of, why are we not allowed to do anything kind of?
Yeah, when I was growing up, maybe this is betraying my age, but at the local swimming pool there was that funny little diagram of 9 things saying you couldn't do running or jumping or dunking or kissing or whatever it was, and it was just like all the things I can't do. Where does it say you can have fun or you can swim? Again, we largely define our world by don'ts. Actually, that's the purpose of laws, is to knock off the edges where you can't go.
You've brought up your background and your childhood, so I think now that we know a little bit more about how you think, I want to talk a bit about that, because it's 2 years between us. I'm on the younger side, in case you are. 76, 78, and looking around the audience, I guess. No, but I think we're all right. We're all right. We're in a good crowd. We can say that here. I think we're all good. And many people here will remember the 1980s, and you remember that sort of what I think of as just ridiculous optimism about the future. Everything was future and it was going to be great, and every design, like the cars, were all sort of sleek and futury. We've changed, haven't we?
I think so. I mean, I grew up in the 80s, 2 years after this fine gentleman. And the 80s for me, certainly in my background and where I was growing up, there was a place of optimism for me. It was filled, even technocratic optimism, to be more pointed. Even things like the A-Team and the movies, the gadget pictures, I call them, Short Circuit, Back to the Future. It was all about this sort of amazing new terrain we could live in if only we just push the technology a bit harder. It was a very optimistic place. And I think even going back to my dad, he hasn't moved from 50 miles from where we grew up his whole life, so he's 82 now. He grew up in post-war Britain, which was, again, struggling, but it had this feeling of like, let's rebuild, let's keep going, this sort of positivity. And I don't feel like that's the case right now. I think it's... I think everyone in the room will probably nod if I said that. We don't really have to go into the explanation of it. It feels like that feeling of sort of compression on everybody's shoulders, and that sort of feeling of uncertainty and a bit of queasiness about the future that certainly wasn't around when I grew up.
Yeah, definitely.
And yet that's fundamentally, and I think probably the most important thing that I'm learning from you, is that the future is sort of irrelevant. What matters most is how we think about it and how we talk about it.
Yeah, I think so. Again, one of the ways of thinking that I think I do quite a lot is try to bring a level of rigor and detail and normalcy to conversations in my world, as you can imagine. When I say my world, I mean technology in Silicon Valley. It's very easy for people to get carried away, either into heavy dystopian land or heavy utopian land. And actually just starting to say, if you're dealing with, just as a straw man, like VR, for example, and you start to have a conversation about it, it does very quickly just drag off into this strange sort of fantasy, whimsical land for a lot of people because of the way they've been trained to think about technology and the future. And not always the thing I try and talk about is, what does this look like in Derek's backpack on the 38 bus in the suburb of Derby? Really just talk about that. And I go home and see my dad, and I go for a pint with him down the social club where you can buy a cup of Bovril for £1, I said $1.
Oh, come on now.
£1.
Give him a big moan and groan.
Sorry, everybody.
We don't approve.
Sorry, I've been, yes. But trying really to think hard about what does this change at all? And if it does change in tiny ways, in major ways, what are they? And as soon as you do that, and as soon as you put people's brothers and cousins and parents and uncles in these worlds that we're talking about, all the coulds and the shoulds and the mights and the don'ts just become real rather than abstract. So I talk about this as what I call the future mundane, which is a way of talking and thinking about the future as a lived-in place where people have Sunday roasts and they go and see their nan and they live with these things. And I think that helps ground the conversation in a kind of healthy way.
Something that's bothering me, because I've got a 21-year-old, and I was talking to you about it. He's incredibly positive. He does not have this sort of, say it again, sorry.
Ambient adolescent apocalypticism.
He doesn't have that, which is I'm surprised by. But then I was talking to him the other day, and he said to me, yeah, the world's different. Yeah, you guys, me and his mum, always go on about this. But the world was different now from when you were a kid. So why is it such a big deal? And I've gone, AI. And he's gone, yeah, but, things happen. Like, they invented trains, and then the people who drove horses and carts went out of jobs. But the world didn't stop, did it, Dad? And I went, yeah, fair play. Why are we so pessimistic when we have gone through massive changes before and come out the other end? Why can't we see the other end now?
Yeah, I mean, one of the challenges that I've faced when I talk about the future mundane is people are facing genuine crises. And when a middle-aged white man in a chore coat from Silicon Valley says, the future mundane, people think I'm trying to sort of diffuse that concern. I'm really not. It's there for good reason, and I feel some of it myself. The part that you're talking about change and experiencing change, if I talk about my dad, for example, he was born in a world before the vinyl album and now lives in a world with ChatGPT. When I was born, there were half as many people on Earth. There were no MRI machines. You could smoke on planes. Kids didn't have to wear seatbelts. The world changes incredibly fast, and I'm not just talking about technological change. I'm talking about societal change. Gay marriage wasn't legal anywhere on Earth when I was born. We take it totally for granted now in many sort of places that we all live. So humans are very adaptable, and we find a way of sort of bringing things into our lives and making sense of them and sort of working around them. I think that's why we are the dominant species on Earth, is because we are so smart and adaptable around things. And an example that you mentioned in the green room, which is a sort of a cupboard filled with bottles of water and anyway.
No, it's really glamorous, actually.
It is. There was no foot rub or anything, just to be clear. But self-driving cars, for example, self-driving taxis are a thing where I live. They're very prevalent, and people take them habitually now. It's a regular part of everyday life. The first time you take one is, whoa, this feels amazing. It's all driving, and the indicators go clickety-clack, and the wheels turns, and it's like a sort of thrill ride. Second time, Third time, you sort of start talking about, we got to go and get some groceries, and and it sort of becomes normalized very, very quickly. And again, I'm not trying to negate the change. I use that as an example to say humans are really adaptable. Same thing, first time you used GPS on your phone, it felt like you were in a sort of MI5 movie or something. Week later, no network, it just becomes normalized very quickly. So again, not trying to negate change, but just saying humans are very, very adaptable, and we have a way of sort of adapting and adopting things into our lives.
When you were younger, Did you imagine that you would ever work in a job like this? What did you want to be?
It's a good question. Not really, no. I mean, I was always a curious kid, creative kid. I did a lot of space Lego. Anyone remember space Lego? Building things.
Ooh, did you ever get Quest magazine?
Quest magazine?
Yeah.
No.
Oh,
maybe it didn't make it north of the Watford Gap.
Yeah, maybe not. Maybe it was a London thing.
Yeah.
It's one of those, science and nature for kids magazines.
Oh, I do remember Quest. Yeah. Did it come in a binder?
I knew he read Quest.
Yeah. So yeah.
It came in a binder.
Yeah.
You put who else? Does anyone remember Quest? It was fantastic.
Just us two. Okay. Sorry.
It was great, but it makes people like this who constantly question, and I see it in you. And that's why I asked about your childhood, because I know that you must have had questions.
Yeah, for sure. And I think Back to the Future came out when I was 9, and it was the perfect sort of thing that hit me between the eyes. But yeah, as a creative kid, I just used to love to draw. I started off copying Garfield comics, and then realized there was a thing you could do called design, and started to learn about that a bit. Just drawing things that didn't exist yet, or imagining things that didn't exist yet, gave you that ability to maybe nudge the future a little bit. That was exciting. And then, yeah, it just sort of snowballed from there, and realized I could do a degree, and then got a job, and then got a master's, and then it just sort of happened. But I think that, again, without wanting to bang the drum of design, it is a really lovely set of skills to have, to be able to bring to life loose ideas or hunches or reckons or bits of language and say, it could look like this, and make a little film or make a little model, or you even just use language in a sort of eloquent way to talk about human experience. I think that's the part of the conversation that I get a huge thrill out of doing what I do. And I think if I didn't do it professionally, I'd do it on the weekends anyway.